The best of money matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. The Electoral Boundaries Review Committee, the committee that determines Singapore's electoral boundaries, has been formed. This now kicks off the official countdown to GE 2025, which must be held by November. In the past 4 elections, the time between the committee's formation and polling day has ranged from 4 to 11 months. This means that voters could go to polls in May or even earlier if the committee is able to complete its work in time. So how does this timeline affect political strategies for various parties? What's next leading up to the next general elections? Well, to find out more, joining us today is Eugene Tan, who's an associate professor of law at the Singapore Management University. Professor, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure, Hongbin.
All right. Okay. So, Professor, what is the role and significance of the Electoral Boundaries Review Committee in Singapore's electoral process?
Well, it has a very significant role simply because this is the committee, that recommends to the Prime Minister how the electoral boundaries ought to be redrawn. But that also means specifying or recommending how many single-member constituencies there should be, how many group representation constituencies, which are the group representation constituencies that should have at least one Malay candidate, and which ones should have an Indian or others candidate. So, as you pointed out, this in a way kicks off, the formal election process in Singapore. And so all eyes, will be very much now on what the committee recommends. The committee, of course, will have to work based on the terms of reference, that the Prime Minister has provided the committee with. And so when the report is published, the Prime Minister typically would, in practice, make it public immediately. And that's when, the election mechanism will go up a few notches. But as you pointed out earlier, right, we could be the elections could be as short as 4 months away. So time is of the essence.
Right, time is of the essence. Well, what are the key factors then that the EBRC will have to consider when reviewing the electoral boundaries? And how do they ensure, fairness in that process?
Hongbin, the committee will have to work with the terms of reference that the Prime Minister has given the committee. And so, for this particular Electoral Boundaries Review Committee, the directive, is that the committee is to review the boundaries of the present electoral divisions and to recommend, the number and the boundaries of the group representation constituencies as well as single-member constituencies. And the Prime Minister adds that, the committee should take into consideration significant changes in the number of electors in each of the current electoral divisions as a result of population shifts and housing development. The other directive, to the committee was to determine the number and size of the group representation constituencies as a single-member constituencies as well. And to this, the committee was asked, to keep the average size of the group representation constituencies, the proportion of members of parliament elected from single-member constituencies, and the average ratio of electors to elected MPs, to be about the same as that of the last general election in 2020. So I think, these are the guidelines, or rather the terms of reference, that the committee, will have to do its work. And I think it's important to recognize that, the committee does its work without fear or favor. If it keeps to the terms of reference, it will result in electoral boundaries, that I would say, are drawn without fear or favor, right? Because the committee, is not in the process of drawing the boundaries, that would favor the incumbent government. And I think these senior civil servants that are part of this committee, they do recognize, that the fairness and integrity of the election process depends very much on how they go about doing their work as well.
Right. Well, we've also seen developments of new towns like Tengah and Bidadari. So how does the development of these new towns impact the redrawing of electoral boundaries?
Yes, so these new towns are obviously part of existing, group representation constituencies or single member constituencies, right? So these are new towns, where the number of voters, would have increased significantly since the July 2020 general election. And so it is likely that current boundaries, will have to be adjusted, partly because of the need to ensure, that each MP would serve about 30,000 voters. Mm-hmm. And so when you have, people leaving one particular area to go to another, the place where people are leaving, obviously, that those boundaries will also, be impacted. So yes, I think when you look at where the new housing estates are, I think many of them are in the western half of the island. I mean, Bidadari is in the eastern half, and I think we can expect to see boundaries being withdrawn, particularly in the western half of the island. But the committee will have to bear in mind, right, what the Prime Minister has directed them, to keep the changes as minimal as possible. I mean, that's my interpretation based on his terms of reference, that how the boundaries will be withdrawn should roughly be about the same as in the last general election.
I see. Well, with that said, Professor, could we see significant changes in constituencies as a result?
I think it's hard to tell at this stage. I think there will be changes for sure. So long as one particular constituency's boundaries are adjusted, there is in a way, that knock-on effect. But I think based on the terms of reference, I anticipate that the committee will seek to keep the changes as minimal as possible, right? So I anticipate that, there will be an incremental approach and that probably will not see any significant, redrawing of the boundaries, But I must emphasize, this is really early days.
Again, as we mentioned earlier, historically, the time between the formation of the EBRC and polling day has ranged from 4 to 11 months. Professor, what might have led to Prime Minister Lawrence Wong to convene the Electoral Boundaries Review Committee today? I mean, what does this timing signal?
Well, I think that, the timing signals, that elections could be, as soon as being 4 months away, or they could, still be some time off, right? Because elections, the latest they are to be called, assuming Parliament completes its 5-year term in August, would be in, that elections will have to be held by the end of November this year. I think as it is, the formation of this committee is relatively late, compared with previous general elections. This is partly, I think, influenced by the fact that Mr. Lawrence Wong, became Prime Minister in May last year. He wasn't in a hurry to get hasty mandate from Singaporeans, and I think he has spent, the time to try to ensure that top-of-the-mind issues, whether they relate to cost of living, or job security concerns, or public housing affordability and accessibility, that in the time that he has since taken over, that a lot more effort has been put to try to reduce, the political sensitivity of these election issues. So I think all that, and of course, this is also about building up the momentum, right? So in 3 weeks' time, we will have the budget, and I think many people would expect, the elections to be held, shortly after Parliament approves of the budget, for the coming financial year.
Well, then how does this timeline affect political strategies for various parties, especially the ruling government and the opposition?
Well, I think for the opposition as well as the ruling parties, they will have to ramp up, their preparation, right? Because if we take the lower end, right, of 4 months, that's actually not a lot of time, for parties to finalize, their slate of candidates, and before that, to decide, which constituencies they want to contest in, and if there are more than one opposition party, that's going to contest in a particular constituency, they will have to try to negotiate and strike a deal, because if you have anything other than a straight fight between the PAP and the opposition party, the party that finishes third, is probably, which is likely to be an opposition party, will probably fare badly, perhaps even losing its electoral deposit. So they will need time, to come to a consensus on, who's to contest where. But for each party, they will also have to finalize the election manifesto, marshal all the resources, whether it's campaign funds or whether it's about volunteers and party activists, to go out and canvass for vote. So 4 months is not a lot. Even if you take the extended one of 11 months, I think that doesn't really give them a lot of time, So I think if any party was really waiting for today's announcement before they start to get themselves all busy, I think they would have lost valuable time. But in any case, it is clear that elections are very near. And so, it's going to be a very busy few months for all political parties parties, that intend to contest in Singapore's next general election.
I see. Well, as you mentioned earlier, Professor, the EBRC's report is expected to recommend changes to the number of GRCs and SMCs. How do you think that these changes could impact the overall electoral landscape in Singapore?
I think sometimes Singaporeans tend to place too much emphasis on how, the boundaries are redrawn. But that is not to say that is not an important issue. It obviously is. But when you look at, partly because of 80% of Singaporeans live in public housing estates, and we have the ethnic integration policy, right, which ensures that every housing estate, right down to each block or neighborhood, is fairly representative of Singapore's, racial composition. That I think, boundaries are redrawn are not really going to impact the overall electoral landscape. Now, obviously, the redrawing of boundaries would affect opposition parties in particular, right? Particularly those opposition parties that may contest only in a few seats. And so, they may have been walking the ground in a particular constituency, and if the boundaries are redrawn in a way, that much of the ground that they walk, is now transferred to another constituency, yes, they could be impacted. It doesn't affect the PAP because the ruling party, because they are represented across the entire island. So, the Electoral Boundaries Review Committee, cannot take into account each individual party's sort of limitation. They have to redraw the boundaries based on what they think, would ensure Singaporeans are adequately represented in Parliament. And because of the GRC, for example, for there to be adequate numbers of minority MPs as well. So yes, it will affect the overall electoral landscape, but I don't think we should make, too much of the impact. Changes will be there. It's really a question of how, parties respond, to those changes.
I see. Well, Professor, Prime Minister Lawrence Wong has emphasized that the timing of the next election will be announced publicly. What factors do you think will influence the decision on when the election will be held?
Well, I think, certainly where the ruling party is concerned, they will want to choose a date where they think the party is likely to fare the best. And I think, obviously, the timing of the next general election, will be made known, right? Because, the parliament will have to be dissolved and the date will have to be announced, for the general election, with elections having to be held within 3 months of Parliament's dissolution. So I think, for Mr. Wong, it'll be very much about trying to ensure that there is a momentum for his government, his party, to be able to persuade voters, that they are best placed to have the mandate of Singaporeans, for the next 5 years. And particularly, right, at a time where there is a lot of desire for a more diverse and competitive political landscape, I think Mr. Wong, as a leader of the ruling party, will have to show, that the one-party dominant system, still works for Singapore, despite, the PAP being in charge for the last 65 years. So I think there are a variety of factors, besides those, such as the international environment, the economic situation. So it's really, a whole gamut, of considerations, but time is of the essence, as I mentioned earlier. And I think, Mr. Wong would have some windows in mind. And I think, whether things turn out as planned, they will have to make do, with whatever date they eventually settle on.
I see. Well, since we're all speculating here, Professor, when do you think the next general election will be held?
Hongbin, I think, there is a good chance, the general election could be as early as the end of April.
Okay.
Or in May. That would enable, the PAPE to write on what I think would be an election budget, that we will hear the budget statement on February 18. And I think, subsequently Parliament will debate the statement as well as the financial allocations for each ministry. And I think the whole idea is to demonstrate, through the budget process, that the PAP government has got a lot of policies and plans in place, to ensure that Singapore will continue to thrive. I think June generally is not a very good date, to have holidays are, to my mind, generally not very it's not a very good time to have a general election. July, to me, would be too close to Singapore's 60th National Day celebrations, and we don't have elections, during the month of August because it's National Day, and August is when, Parliament's 5-year term would be over. And I don't think Mr. Wong, would want to contemplate, being confined, to the window between September and November. So I would say that, April, May is probably where I will put my money, assuming I'm a betting person.
I see. And before we let you go here, Professor, what else will you be looking out for in the lead up to GE 2025?
I think, elections are also very much about the candidate. And so I think, many Singaporeans, myself included, would be looking to see what each party has to offer in terms of, the prospective candidate. And I certainly will also want to see what sort of plans and policies, they have in mind, to deal with, the different issues that Singapore and Singaporeans are facing. So to me, right, it's really about people and the plan. And I suppose, a third consideration would be how each party goes about trying to win the hearts and minds of Singaporeans, even before the election date is announced.
I see. Well, thank you so much, Professor, for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me, Hongbin.
Thank you. That was Eugene Tan, Associate Professor of Law at the Singapore Management University. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.